Hopefully you can hear me. Give me 1 second here. I want to make sure you can hear me. And since all of the attendees are on mute, I know you can't respond and say, yes, we can hear you or not. Let's see. Actually, okay, I can tell that you all can hear me. But would a few of you just in the questions tab on the right hand of your screen say, oh, somebody already did. Can hear you. I hear you. Thanks, guys. Okay, good. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jamie Simone. I'm the Professional Development Officer in Illinois. Welcome to today's webinar in preparation for the AICP exam. Today's topic is about quantitative methods and research. I'm going to take care of a couple of housekeeping items first. As I already mentioned, you will be on mute the whole time. For those of you who have been on this before, you know this already, but I'll just go through it again for new people. You'll be on mute the entire time. If you have questions or concerns, please send a question to me in the question tab on the right hand of your side of your screen, which some of you have already done, and I will respond to those throughout the session. If they're simple questions that I can answer on my own, I will just answer them. If they're questions that I need the presenters to answer, I will keep a log of them throughout the session, and then they will be answered at the end of the session. Today's session will likely be shorter than most of the other ones. We, as the co-op of chapters who ran this together, we decided to separate quantitative methods from plan making. Usually those are covered together, but we felt like they were different topics and deserved their own time. So this session may be a little bit shorter than the others for that reason. The session is being recorded, and it will be available on the Utah website, the Utah chapter of the APA's website. They have a whole webinar archive that they keep. And so when the session is over, as I said, it's being recorded, I will send it to the folks who run that website, and they will upload it, and it will be available for you to download and listen to and view again. The PowerPoint slides were not available in advance, and they will not be available after the session, but like I said, you can view them via the recording on the Utah chapter website. I think those are all the housekeeping issues. Like I said, if you have questions, send them to me from the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. I am going to change presenters here and send it over to the people who are presenting today. We have John Houseal and Devin Levine of Houseal Levine Associates in Chicago. And we also have Trevor Dick, who's a senior planner with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And they are co-creators of Planning Prep. And I will hand it over to them. And John, I just handed you the baton. Okay, I can see your screen, so we're good to go. Thanks.
Great, great. Well, thanks, Jamie. This is Devin Levine. I'll be leading through the first, I guess, 50% of the presentation here this morning. And thank you all for coming, and best of luck on the exam. This morning's topic is quantitative methods. And a brief introduction first about the presenters. This is John Houseal's bio. He's a principal and co-founder of Houseal Levine Associates. He has 20 years of public and private sector experience. So you can see John's credentials there. These are mine. I have 15 years of both public and private sector experience. And like John, a principal and co-founder of Houseal Levine Associates. And Trevor Dick, who is a senior associate at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning with similar experience, 15 years. And Trevor and I have worked together for about 10 of those years, and we co-created Planning Prep back in 2002. So just real briefly, what is Planning Prep? We created it in 2002. It won a Illinois chapter of the APA Gold Award in 2007 for Best Tool. It's an online study resource to help you prepare for the exam. By no means should it be the only resource you use, although we have heard people have passed the exam just with the website, although I wouldn't recommend it, especially if you're not from a planning background or planning education. It's definitely a great refresher if you went through a planning school. There's over 1,000 practice questions on there. There's practice exams. And what we try to do on each of the multiple choice questions is give you an explanation. There used to be a fee for this. We used to charge, I think, $120 for a membership. It's now free of charge. Something we heard, the three of us did a webinar on March 2nd, 2 weeks ago, on plan making, and something we heard in the Q&A was there's a way for people to coordinate study groups. And upon hearing that, we had forums on our website. We took those down, but the last couple of days we set up a Facebook page for planning prep. And so if you want to head over to Facebook, there's a way for people who are preparing for the exam to have like presentation on location quotient. I thought it was a pretty good article that succinctly explained what it was and how to calculate it. So in addition to planning prep, you can also head over to Facebook and look at and it breaks it down by topic area. And this quantitative methods falls under this 30% plan making and implementation. And they go on, they have this list of A through R. These are the different topics that concern this morning's presentation. You can see we're dealing with a pretty small subset of the overall plan making, and that sort of speaks to what Jamie was saying. It might be a shorter presentation. Real quickly, we'll jump into what we're calling our first calculation. So we know there's 170 questions on the exam. There's 20 that are pre-test, and I don't know if that's been explained to you, but some of the early questions, and not necessarily the first 20, but in the first part of the exam, there's 20 pre-test questions that are intended to get you familiar with the software and the online testing, and those don't actually count towards your score. The exam is 150 questions, but there's 20 pre-tests, but they're not necessarily the first 20 questions. So the advice we give to people that have taken our course is not to rifle through the first 20 questions and start at question 21, because some of those questions could count. So we know we got 170 questions, 30% will cover plan making and implementation. And so if we take 170 and times it by 0.3, we 51 questions that will cover plan making and implementation. 6 of those which are pre-test. This quantitative and qualitative research is one topic, so it's 5.6%. So mathematically speaking, there's 2.85 questions on the exam. 0.33 will be pre-test. So you can see we're dealing with, if you just can't get your arms around statistics and it's something that you don't know, and learn the other material first and maybe come to this, because in terms of the larger picture, it's a relatively small portion of the exam. There could be more, there could be less. There's no guarantee that there will be an equal distribution of those 18 subcategories, but just to show you some quick math up front, that's those numbers. The APA selected reading list for plan making implementation lists 4 different books that sort of pertain. One is the census website down at the bottom. And there's a couple, and then the statistics for Cliff's quick review right at the bottom too. So there'd be 5 books that pertain to statistics. So if you're looking to see what exactly you need to be studying, these are the books. So why so much attention to quantitative methods? You can see here these are the different webinars that have been prepared as part of this series. And you can see quantitative methods is sort of pulled out and given its own topic area, despite the fact that it's a relatively small portion. We took a look at the Chapter President's Council Study Guide. There's 236 pages of material. 25% of that book is dedicated to quantitative methods. And I think the reason there's so much attention given to this is that, planners struggle with statistics, and we generally don't use these skills on a daily basis. And so as a result, they can be quickly forgotten. But I will say that there's typically no gray area when you're dealing with statistics and math and quantitative methods. It's right or it's wrong, and I think that part of it makes it sort of a favorable study topic, because when you get to that sort of end of your conclusion on the exam, you know that your answer is right. Now, that being said, I don't know if you've had the run through of what types of questions to expect. Brandon here at our office threw this together as an example of the type of question you might want to see, is sort of which one of these is correct. And you wouldn't think there's an answer, but apparently there is an answer, and it might depend on where you're sitting. There's also questions. This is another one that we sort of have shown at different training sessions. Which of these numbers is greater than 0? And if you're ever faced with, if you get a question like this on the exam, this is a sort of John Houseseal at the last session was speaking to this. There's a lot of questions where there's multiple right answers, and you need to take the one that is most correct or the best answer. And so, it's kind of a funny type of question here, but the answer would be D, because it's furthest away from 0. Would be almost how that would score. I don't think you'll see a question like that, but there's a lot of gray area on the exam, and fortunately for this part, we can usually get to a calculation that's right or wrong. So the structure of today's webinar, we structured it around the Chapter President's Council guide, which had 7 different sections, and so we'll run through these 7 topic areas. So an overview of the concepts. There's 3 different types of data. There's discrete data, which is a set of finite data values. It's integers only. So example is like you can say a building has 10 rooms. It's just a number. Continuous data is values in a continuous range, like a temperature or height. And then nominal data is values that represent labels or names, so good, bad, fair, poor. And that sort of relates to the types of different scales. You have an ordinal scale, which numbers indicate a position in a list or ranking. So we often use these types of scales when we say, rank these images from excellent to poor. Scale, and then a ratio scale, a ratio between intervals independent of a unit of measurement. And so it's used to measure maybe the cost of one project to another if you're doing cost-benefit analysis, floor area ratio. You're comparing something to a fixed variable. Some of the key terms, you have a mean. A mean is the average of numbers. So if you have a set of numbers, you would add up the total of those numbers and divide it by the number of values that were in that equation. The median is that number that divides the values into 2 equal groups. And if you're ever in a position of an even number of values, so if you have to figure out the median of, say, 6 numbers, well, there is no one number that will divide that into 2 equal groups. And so what you would do is you take the 2 numbers that were right in the middle, and you would take the average of those 2 numbers. Mode is the value with the highest frequency. So in a list of numbers, which one is cited most frequently? Then the range is the difference between the largest and the smallest values. So real quickly here's a table, some examples. So you have this group of numbers, 3, 4, 6, 8, 3, 6, 11, 17, 5, 23, 6, 18, 21, 3, 17, 20, 24, and 16. And then 6 numbers on the right side. So your mean is 11.10. So again, it's the sum of all of those numbers up above it divided by the actual total number of numbers within that number set. The median is 8. The mode, this one we have 2 modes because 3 occurs 3 times and 6 occurs 3 times. Then the range, you take the highest value and the lowest value and subtract it, you get 20. And then on the right side, you can see we do it. Same calculation. We took an even data set, so you can see the median is 20,505. and it's the average of those two values. So real quickly, it's how to calculate mean, median, and mode. I think from what I've heard, speaking to just about everyone that's taken the exam, there's some easy question relating to one of these types of statistics on the exam. We look at the types of statistics. We have descriptive statistics, which are describe observed data and organize and summarize. So it might be something like taking census data and describing what is in the data. What's the median household income? What's the average age of a population? Inferential statistics is to infer conclusions from a sample about the broader population. And this is where you don't have the ability to get records from everyone in the population, so you take a subset, which is what the image is showing there, basically from those 5 purple figures. You're able to draw generalizations about the rest of the population. Some key terms relating to statistics: variance. It's a measure of how far a set of numbers is spread out. The standard deviation is a measurement of variability. It's the dispersion around the mean, and it's the square root of variance. So it's how a typical number differs from the rest. And if you have a low standard deviation, that means your data points are real close to the mean. If you have a high standard deviation, that means the data points are sort of large and spread out. And so if you think of a bell curve, a low standard deviation is going to be sort of a real tight and narrow curve. A high standard deviation is going to be wide and spread out. And then another sort of phrase you may hear is a z-score. A z-score is the number of standard deviations, and it's used to test this hypothesis, and you use it to reject or accept a null hypothesis. A population, it's a collection that contains anything. It could be a set of people. It could be people under the age of 40. It could be the students at a school. It could also be the number of parkway trees along Wilson Street. So it's a collection that contains anything. A sample is a subset of that population. A random sample is a randomly selected sample where each member of a population has an equal chance of being selected, and that is critical to validity in inferential statistics. A random sample, it's in caps there. It's truly is critical to being able to make generalizations. And then a stratified random sample is a variation of the random sample, but the population can be divided into mutually exclusive groups or strata. And so it could be men or women, or take a survey within a community. It might be residents in neighborhood A, neighborhood B, but it's some other type of grouping of your random sample. So you take a look at a bell curve. Your mean is right in the middle. It's the line that is right down the middle of a normal distribution. Your first standard deviation, generally your first standard deviation will capture about 68% of a number set, or of your data. And again, if you're within one standard deviation, you're closer to the mean. You're closer to sort of the average of the values of a number set. 2 standard deviations capture about 95% or 97% of the data, and then lastly, 3 standard deviations is 99.9%. So that's basically how a normal distribution works. There's some great articles on Wikipedia. If you just type in standard deviation, you can see this curve, as well as a pretty good explanation about how to use it to make inferences and evaluate numbers. We've heard of skewed data. Data gets skewed. There's a negative skew and a positive skew, and I can remember thinking these were always logically going in the wrong direction from what I sort of think a negative skew would be skewed left. But what happens with a negative skew is you have a value that's so far to the left of the mean that it pulls the tail out to the left side, and so the data looks like it's leaning right. And then a positive skew is the opposite. You have a number that's to the right of your mean, and it pulls the tail to the right side. So those are the 2 different types of skews, and that's how they sort of relate to the the bell curve. This is sort of everything is centered around the mean, and it has a normal distribution around the mean. And this, you have some outliers that are pulling the mean in one direction. When you test a hypothesis, you'll see this. If you see an H with a lowercase o, that's a null hypothesis. It's the hypothesis of no difference. It's what you actually test to be rejected. An alternative hypothesis is your research hypothesis, and it's taken if you can reject your null hypothesis. So to put that into layman's terms, if you sort of wanted to see did the new streetscape project along Wilson Street have any impact on property values? So you'd set out, that's the question you'd like to ask. Well, what you actually test is that the property values along Wilson Street have not changed. If you're able to reject that hypothesis, that you're now showing that they have changed, then you can accept your alternative hypothesis. So you actually test a null hypothesis, and when you can reject it statistically, you accept an alternative hypothesis. The next sort of section related in the Chapter President's Council book, Chapter 14, is population estimates. And I guess I'd like to say the Chapter President's Council study guide is probably a great resource. If you haven't gotten a copy of it, I'd contact your PDO and get a copy of it. I have noticed, sort of going through it, the PDF that's available now, it looks like it's a scan and it's been character recognized, and it's resulted in a lot of typos. And so when you go through it, and it's probably the worst part of the whole study guide where you think you want a typo. And there's a couple points where it talks about medium home value instead of median home value. An integral part of the PAN or instead of the plan. So when it did this character recognition, I think it put into here a lot of different typos. So maybe we can get that proofread and edited, but it's a great study resource, especially for this section. So population estimates, there's reasons we want to estimate population as planners. We need the current and future. It's important for long-range planning and future government funding. We need it to assist government agencies, decision makers, school districts, park districts, all of our community service providers, provide senior services and facilities, and it's also used to determine federal and state funding, as well as some other different things. So there's key terms relating to population estimates. You have estimates. They're calculated for the current population levels. So if you're estimating your current population, we're not always fortunate to be where we are right now with a recently completed census. Often, we're several years away from a census, and we have to estimate our current population using the previous census. And it's our understanding that the data from the 2000 census is yet to make it into the exam. And so maybe this is why they want to sort of make sure your skills are sharp in population estimating. Forecasts, more subjective, and it's to basically project out a population. It's sort of related to population projections to calculate for future population levels. Some of the key terms here, too, that relate to this are migration. It's the movement of people in or out of a study area. So net migration is the people that have left. Natural increase, it's the crude birth rate minus death rate. And so those are different ways and different ways and figures you'll need to calculate population projections and population estimates. So when you estimate, there's three different ways to estimate population: migration and natural increase. And so you take a known population level, so let's say the 1990 census, and you identify the population that's moved into that area, as well as the natural increase, the new births and the deaths within that area, and you can get to a population estimate. A ratio or step down, that's used to, probably the easiest way to explain that, if you want to identify the population of a neighborhood. You could identify maybe a census tract that fully encloses that neighborhood. You'd figure out what percentage of land area that neighborhood represents of that census tract, and then you would just sort of use some calculations to figure out what the population estimate would be. So again, you're sort of making some generalizations and assumptions. Symptomatic, basically you're looking for different changes that are visible that show signs of population increase. So you might take a past census, say a 1997 special census, and then you'd look at how many that's the symptomatic method. Projecting, similar to estimating. One of the things is cohort survival. You take your population, you put it into a population pyramid, and you age through the cohorts. You have, again, net migration and natural increase. There's figures that are employment driven, and I think they say that some economic development people think this is a good way, and they basically, you look at how many jobs have been created within an area, and you use that as a way to estimate population. Step down, again, real similar. If you have a population forecast for a larger area, and you know how big your study area is in relation to the larger area, you would step down. Mathematics and graphics. This would be like a scatter plot or a line chart where you establish a trend line that you would then sort of continue to draw that trend line out over a time period to get a population number. And then holding capacity. It's just how much population could a land area support. So if you're maybe a landlocked community that's surrounded by a number of different other communities, and you have only 640 acres left of land to annex, you could do your population projection by figuring out how many people can live in those 640 acres. So, census.gov and FactFinder, great resources for demographics. And so if you haven't visited that website, it's in the list of recommended readings, and there are some real interesting facts that I think will help you with some other questions, as well as give you a feel for how to deal with population estimates and projections. I wanted to show this chart again. We showed this a couple weeks ago, and we had a question that was asked near the end of the Q&A session, and this is the Rust Belt declining populations. This is the amount of population decline in these communities since the year 1960. So over the course of 50 years, this is the population decline, and that's a critical piece of information that's missing from this graphic, but I thought I would make that clear. So this is a population pyramid, and the cohort survival method. What you would do is age these cohorts. So if you're looking at projecting what the population would be like in 5 years or 10 years, you would take each of these bars along your pyramid and you'd start to raise them up, factoring in death rates and birth rates, and you sort of age a population pyramid. It's an example of the step-down method. Here's a question. You might see something like this on the exam. The latest census reported the population of Centerville to be 24,000. Riverside is a neighborhood you're studying. It's located within Centerville. Has historically been one of the larger, more vibrant neighborhoods. At the time of the last census, 8% of the population lived in the Riverside neighborhood. 5 years have passed, and the city has experienced growth in all of its neighborhoods. The current population of Centerville is estimated to be 32,000. So if you had to use the step-down method, you would basically take 32,000 and times it by 8%. That would basically step down the current population to what you think the population of Riverside. Symptomatic, this is another example. We have population of Centerville of 24,000. Since then, they've issued 312 permits for construction of single-family homes, 10 permits for commercial businesses, 2 for construction of multifamily developments, which will have 62 and 40 dwelling units respectively. And then it goes on to give you the size of an average size of a single-family household, 3.2 people, and a multifamily dwelling unit, 2.4. And then there's, we go in here, we say the average commercial business employs 1 person for every 250 square feet. It's just some and expect this to see this on the exam, just some additional data that doesn't factor into your calculation. So you can ignore the what a commercial business employs. It doesn't pertain to this question. And even when I was going through some of the sample questions the APA has provided, it seems like something that they like to do to sort of throw you off to make sure you know what you're doing. They'll put in some extraneous information that doesn't relate to this question. And so one of the things to keep in mind here when you're doing this type of math, whenever you're trying to figure out how many people live in an area, so if you have 3.2 people and there's 312 permits, you want to round up. There's no 912.6 people. That would be 913. So you're always going to round up when you're dealing with population projections like this. Next topic area is shift share analysis. Shift share is a technique used to look at changes in employment in the set of an area. It's used to compare a region or area's share of employment across either the nation or a larger region. So regional scientists widely use this technique to examine the source of employment growth. So it's basically comparing your study area to the share of national or regional growth. Sort of related to this is sort of the local component of shift share's location quotient. It's the ratio of proportion of a local employment in one sector to a similar portion in the national economy. And closely related to this is the economic base analysis. Basically divides regional industries into two different areas. You have basic, which is export, and non-basic, which is local. And it assumes that the basic sector drives the economy, I guess because the non-basic sector, local sector, is sustaining that community or that region. So location quotient can be used for determining the impact of a change in economy and predicting future growth. This was a question in the back of the last couple of pages, and so it's a sample questions from them. Listed above are two types of employment percentages for industries X, Y, and Z in a metropolitan. Method, economic planner can assign which of these industries to the export sector of the metropolitan area. So your choices are X only, Y only, Z only, and Y and Z only. And I'll explain this. So you're looking at comparing the local economy as to a reference economy. In this case, I think it looks like we're comparing the local economy to the national. So you're looking to calculate the ratio between the two. So the ratio is called the location quotient. And so this is how to calculate location quotient. And in this question, it's already been done for you. But it's you take a look at your total regional employment in any industry divided by the total regional employment. And then once you have that number, which is that first percentage column, you're going to divide it by the national employment. And how to interpret location quotient, it's easy. There's only three outcomes. You have less than 1, 1, or greater than 1. And if it's less than 1, then it suggests that your industry is not meeting local demand and that you're importing. If it's 1, it's sufficient to meet local demand. If it's greater than 1, then there's extra jobs and you must be exporting goods and services. So thinking back to this question, the question basically says which of these can an economic planner assign to the export sector? It's basically the ones that have a higher percentage of local employment over national employment, and so it's Y and Z only. And so whenever I get another little tip, I guess, when I get to a question like this, if you're having a hard time sort of wrapping your brain around it, if you try replacing the variables with names. So if you think of like a medical industry, auto, mining, it might help you sort of figure it out and just sort of make it seem less mathematic and more sort of personable and real life. There's a chapter in the Chapter President's Council study guide called Comparing Alternative Lives with Unequal Lives. And what this is getting at is life cycle analysis. And they give you a lot of formulas in here, pretty complicated. And at this point, you're not going to have any types of tables with z-scores and to be able to sort of look up to see if something is statistically significant. So the math in this exam is going to be incredibly complicated. But you need to sort of know how the formulas generally work and what they're generally saying. And so when you get into these study guides, if you see a lot of formulas, you don't have to put a lot of memorization in the formulas, just know the basic concepts. And so this life cycle analysis just provides a way to compare different things that have different life cycles. So if maybe you're buying fleet vehicles, one of them's more expensive but will last 20 years, and one of them's less expensive will only last 10 years. Well, this gives you the math basically to figure out how to compare those two to see what would be best suited for your department or agency. And with that, I will pass it over to Trevor, who will speak to budgeting.
Okay. Thank you very much, Devin. As Devin said, I'm going to spend a couple minutes to talk about two topic areas in this section. The first is budgeting, and then I'll follow it up with financial and cost analysis. For many of you who were on our previous presentation a couple weeks ago, this may be a little repetitive, but we just can't assume that everybody was on it a couple weeks ago. We're still going to cover the same type of definitions, terms, and topics, but we'll add a little bit more, especially to relate more to the overall topic, which is the quantitative and qualitative analysis. In terms of budgeting, planners really need to be aware of the different types of budgeting terms, the different types of budgets that can be produced, and the different ways that budgets can be created, but also, more importantly, how budgets impact planners excuse me, on a daily basis. So we'll start with what is a budget. Well, we'll actually start with even more of a famous quote. It's one of these quotes that often comes up in the examination. It's by Aaron Wildansky, which is, "A budget is a series of goals with price tags attached." That's an example of a quote you may see on the examination, so be aware of who is the famous planner who said that. A budget is about allocating and spending tax dollars to provide services to the public. Generally, if the taxes, if the budget wasn't in place, then the local residents, for example, would have to pay for it themselves. So the budget looks at how to best spend dollars, tax dollars, to serve the greater good. For public planners, not only does this impact our salaries, but often impacts our work plan. And as we all know, especially planners who work in the government sector, budgets are very political. And budgets are often the way that the layperson, for example, can see what is the most important projects, attitude, or areas of concern for the elected officials. Budgeting is tied to not only the elected officials' goals, but the administration's policies and actions. Budget preparation consists of three key things to think about when we start estimating. So we look at first estimating how much cash will be available at the start of the fiscal period. You really want to see the baseline. What do we have right now in the coffer, so to speak? The second key point in estimating is how much additional revenue will be raised from the beginning of the fiscal period to its end. And the third is how much cash will be available at the very end of the fiscal period. Those are three very important things to keep in mind as we prepare budgets. This next section, we want to talk about the methods of finance. So once you start preparing your budget, you really want to look at, okay, what are the different ways that we can create the financing tools and bring finance into the municipality, for example. The first is current revenue, or which is commonly called pay-as-you-go. This is the financing of improvements from current revenues, such as taxes, fees, or service charges. Very, very common. The next is reserve funds and general obligation bonds. In reserve fund financing, funds are accumulated in advance and often pay for larger capital construction or purchase projects. A lot of this money may be earmarked or surplused, especially from the year before, but this is often very important for larger projects. General obligation bonds, very similar. The taxing power of the jurisdiction or the municipality, for example, is pledged to pay interest upon and retire the debt. The obligation bonds cannot be or can be sold to finance permanent types of improvements such as schools, municipal buildings. This is something that is very common in paying for recreational centers, parks, for example. And sometimes voter approval may be required. It depends on your local rules, jurisdictions, the state that you are operating in, but general obligation bonds are another way to finance budget items. The next is revenue bonds. Revenue bonds are frequently sold for projects, and these projects typically include water and sewer systems and the type of projects that are likely expected to produce revenue. So if there's a fee that could be charged at the end, revenue bonds are often sold in advance to pay for that project. The next is lease purchase. Lease purchase is a method where, for example, if a private company or authority already has the facility in place that the community needs. For example, up here in Chicago, if it's a hockey arena, and there's a community called Darien where there was a hockey arena built, there was a demand for the community to have a hockey arena, so they entered into a lease purchase, and after paying for rent over, I think it was 15 or 20 years, at the end of the day, the municipality actually owns the hockey arena. The next is authorities and special districts. This may be special districts to help pay for a special item or need from the community. Quite often it's a school district, library district, or park district. The next is special assessments. That's something that could be charged to a specific area. For example, if it is a neighborhood that needs new sidewalks, a special assessment can be charged on that neighborhood to help pay for the sidewalk, and is generally has to be paid by the residents or the businesses or the area that will be specifically benefited by that new project. State and federal grants, pretty obvious. These are the number of grants that are out there. This constantly changes. An excellent source to keep track of grants is grants.gov, easy for me to say this morning, grants.gov, and it's a great way to keep track of the grants that seem to be constantly changing, and it's a good source for you and your community to see what grants are out there and what are available. The last method of finance we want to talk about this morning is TIF, tax increment financing. We talked about this a little bit last time, but for those maybe who weren't on the call a couple weeks ago, some of the key things to keep in mind with TIF are that they are typically administered in the following ways. First, a TIF area is established, and that is typically created around a blighted area. There's a number of criteria, requirements that need to be met to make an area, quote unquote, a blighted area. After that, TIF bonds are then issued to promote redevelopment in the area and to actually do some redevelopment in the area, such as infrastructure. In the end, when there's new development that's brought into the area, that tax increment is used to then retire the TIF bonds that were issued to help redevelop the area in the first place. And one note to keep in mind, this can be very controversial because some of the special districts, such as school districts, can't use the additional revenues until those TIF bonds are retired. The next section is the different types of budgeting systems. And this morning we want to talk about three of the biggest budgeting systems, three of the most popular that you probably would encounter as a planner. The first is PPBS, Planning, Programming, and Budgeting Systems. Some of the key terms and important things to keep in mind are that it was developed in the early 1960s by the Defense Department, and it is organized in three ways. Number one, it is organized into spending programs rather than functional objects. Number two, PPBS has extended its programs far enough into the future so that it can determine the spending implications. And number three, all programs are subject to explicit quantitative analysis, which means that it looks at what the functional object is doing, what the project is planned to do, what it's planned to cost, and then lastly, basically, what is the benefit of this project going to be? And it comes up with a rational quantitative analysis at the end to try and determine which project should be completed. The next is MBO, as it's often called, Management by Objectives. This was created in 1954 by Peter Drucker, and really it organizes goals into performance objectives. It really has planners and elected officials take a step back and look at how the project will meet a goal, how it's expected to meet objectives, and then rank it at the end to see which one would meet the objectives more efficient and more effective. Zero-based budgeting is the third, and that was created in the 1960s by Texas Instruments. And basically, some of the key term to remember here is that it starts from scratch every year. There's another term that you're often likely to see on the examination: what budgeting system starts from scratch every year? And of course, the answer would be zero-based budgeting. It breaks down the budget into smaller quote-unquote decision packages. Those decision packages are then tied back to objectives and then ranked. This next chapter, we're going to talk a little bit about financial and cost analysis. This is very much tied to budgeting in general. So planners need to be aware not only of budgeting, but what are the financial and cost analysis techniques out there and how to best use them. The first thing we wanted to talk about is some key definitions for financial analysis. The first is equity versus efficiency. And to be quite honest, this is a struggle for local governments. Local governments constantly have to struggle between what is equity and what is efficiency. For example, what is fair to the most people, but also what is the most efficient way of getting the most return for the dollar. And it's a constant struggle for local governments. The next is horizontal equity versus vertical equity. And horizontal equity means equal treatment for people in equal economic circumstances, while vertical equity, which is the exact opposite of that, that looks at an unequal tax treatment for an unequal economic circumstances. The third, market value. This is pretty common. This is something we hear a lot about, especially if you're a homeowner like you're myself. It's a thing I don't like to look or think about very often. But market value is what is the estimated market value of what your property could sell for, presumably on an open market. And it's the property is taxed on the basis of what the property assessor's estimation of that property is worth. The next is progressive, proportional, and regressive taxation. These are some terms that you're not very likely to see on a daily basis, but they are some of the things you may be asked on the examination. A progressive tax is a tax where the ratio of tax payments to income increases as income rises. And then the ratio of a proportional tax is constant, while the ratio for regressive tax declines as income rises. And those are the four big methods that a lot of people look at when talking about local finance, some of the big terms. The next thing we're going to look at is financial innovations. And there's three examples of financial innovations listed here. And really this is what's happened, especially from the local communities, looking at different ways to try and get as much tax share or tax revenue as they can. The first is regional tax-based sharing. This is an example. This is actually done in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. It's one of the first to carry out this program, where taxes are gathered throughout the entire region and then shared throughout all the local municipalities in that region. It's a very unique way of looking at that. This could work, I think, in an example where maybe a local municipality doesn't have a big regional shopping center, maybe not be getting a lot of tax revenue or sales tax revenue. Maybe it's a purely residential community, and this is a way maybe to get some of the sales tax revenue shared throughout all the different types of municipalities in that region. TIF, I talked about that a few slides ago, but that is definitely a local tool that municipalities can use to try and gather some revenue. And then property tax abatement, which is really where we start to provide incentives to local developers or businesses to come to your community. There may be a reduction or taxes may be waived altogether because they know that at the end of the day that new business is going to provide a lot more sales tax revenue than property tax that's going to come in. The last slide I'm going to talk about here is different ways to look at cost analysis. So in the budgeting process, we've looked at the different ways we can budget it, how to prepare for it. We've looked at the different types of revenue sources. And now we're going to look at, okay, what are the different ways we can look at the best bang for our buck, so to speak? What are the different ways to look at and analyze the costs? The first is GAM, which is the Goals Achievement Matrix. And there's some key things to keep in mind here. It's really a chart which shows the anticipated accomplishments of the project's goals and the distribution of those accomplishments amongst the various groups. And it'll be obvious when you see a goals achievement matrix, because not only is it a chart, but on the left-hand side is a column where each of the objectives are listed, and then there's a row for each specific community group. So at the end of the day, you can follow that along, you can follow that action to see how that particular group will benefit from that action. The next is cost effectiveness analysis. This is the one where we focus on a single objective and a project's effectiveness on meeting that particular objective. Often, two or more objectives may result in the same objective being met. But at the end of the day, in this analysis, you look at which alternative has the lowest cost and will yield the largest net benefit to the community. Cost-benefit analysis. This is where we look at what the community can gain from the project, what the benefits are, to what the costs to the community are. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we see which benefit is greater, and that is deemed to be the most worthy pursuit. Cost-revenue analysis. A systematic comparison of two money flows. Basically, you're looking at what money's coming in, what money's coming out, and that equates to a cost-revenue ratio where the one that has the best benefit is selected. So that's really the key definitions, key terms we wanted to talk about in the budgeting and financial section. Once again, it's important for planners to be aware of the different terms and technology and how it impacts us as planners on a daily basis. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to walk us through our next section.
All right, good morning, everybody. This will be quick. I'm going to be going over real quickly cost-benefit analysis. And the main thing to remember with cost-benefit analysis, the concept is very simple and as applied to the exam and exam questions based on past examinations and talking to people that have taken it. It's often a scenario-based question where they'll give you a scenario of a development or a proposed impact or an infrastructure expenditure and the anticipated budget for the project and installation costs of the project, and the anticipated benefit in terms of revenue sales tax or property tax or something else. And then it'll ask you what the best type of analysis is to determine if whether the project is worth going forward. And cost-benefit analysis or benefit-cost analysis is exactly what it sounds like, and it's a very logical approach. And conceptually, it makes perfect sense. The challenge is, and what you have to understand, is that its strength lies in its concept in terms of a way to approach analysis of a problem. But almost never in the planning world is it a pure statistical or numeric analysis that we can use to make a question or determine an outcome of a situation. And the problem is that there are scenarios, there's nuances in what we do with the public realm, because it's not a private company often, but a public realm situation from a planning perspective, that weighs into and has to be factored into our recommendations. Examples that are given are things like, excuse me, if there's a scenario or an emergency, a disaster, something that strikes a community, and the local leaders might say, boy, we can never afford to allow this to happen again. You know, this, no matter what it costs, this situation can never happen again in our community. So cost-benefit analysis goes out the window. Communities in this situation often then weigh the intangible benefit to the public good or public health, safety, and welfare, and it outweighs any rational thinking with regard to cost benefit or what the underlying cost is of something versus the numeric or actual tangible measure. Nothing is too good for our boys in blue. Well, whatever it takes, we'll do anything these guys need. Nothing is too good for guys to put their lives on the line. Cost-benefit analysis, again, there has to sort of take a second seat. You have to be fiscally aware and wise with your expenditures from a municipal perspective, but you often, in terms of what you're willing to spend on the benefit gain or perceived benefit gain from a community. So these are the things you have to keep in mind. So good cost-benefit analysis balances against these single-purpose issues or emotional issues with a more realistic and balanced measure of the cost benefits of the situation. The bottom is, the pitfalls are that we have to get past these other problems, the perceptions of issues, and the sort of the moral or the policy objectives or priorities of an individual community or an elected body. So the most valuable way of thinking of cost benefit is that is a concept. The value of this is in the concept rather than using it as a rigid and narrow decision-making rule. So again, cost-benefit analysis on the exams typically manifests as a scenario question or a very, very simple mathematical situation where they will say, here's a table identifying the costs and anticipated benefits or values of a proposed development. And then using cost-benefit analysis, you may determine whether, as a decision-making tool, it is worthwhile to go forward with the project or whether it is not worthwhile to go forward with the project. But those are some of the pitfalls you have to remember. It's a valuable way of thinking, but it can be very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to implement in a public realm because we have to balance emotions, community priorities, and realistically what we have to measure as professional planners is the political world that we have to navigate on a daily basis. But there's real value to this type of cost or this type of analysis on any type of a project. A couple of pitfalls you need to be aware of if they do ask an exam a question relating to this. When they ask what kind of variables ought to be considered, the bottom line is any variable and all variables, to the extent possible, need to be included in the equation. So it may be that you have to use your knowledge of what a surface parking space costs to construct and build, including land acquisition and asphalting or concreting the surface, versus decked or structured parking, and knowing that one costs more in terms of your cost-benefit analysis. The other hurdle that you need to overcome or realize this is a shortcoming, because it may ask you what are the shortcomings of cost-benefit analysis. That may be the question as opposed to complex calculations. And one of them is the projected value of something going forward. When we conduct cost-benefit analysis, we usually do so with economic values at place in time the calculation or analysis is undertaken. But most of those decisions have an impact going forward into the future, but most cost-benefit analysis does not take into account anything other than present-day valuation of both the cost and the benefits of whatever the project is that's being considered, as opposed to projected, calculating in the costs and the factor of inflation, deflation, devaluation over time. So that's one of the shortcomings of this type of economic approach, is that it uses present-day valuation as opposed to projected valuation going forward. But the key thing to remember for the exam is the shortcomings of cost-benefit analysis, why it's often a more conceptual approach to try to aim for as opposed to a rigid statistical formula in terms of determining outcomes, and understand what the shortcomings are of such an analysis and approach, because the exam questions you will likely get on this are scenario-based rather than statistically based. Deb's going to real quick go through a couple of questions regarding benefit cost analysis, and then I think we'll be ready for Q&A.
Thanks, John. These actually don't pertain to cost-benefit analysis, but another example of I think a quantitative method question that I pulled out of that AICP guide. It runs through a scenario. It says there's two questions that pertain to the following information. It's the desirability and feasibility of a proposed shopping center are to be evaluated. So a developer owns 30-acre parcel, proposes to construct a 250,000 square foot leasable area with 1,300 on-site parking spaces. I mentioned extraneous information, basically the whole trade area. I found my version of the AICP prep manual from 2001, and there were 4 questions pertaining to this scenario, and the second 2 actually had that's where the 20,000 and households 12,000 income came into play. But for these questions that are in this guide, you don't need that information. Right off the bat here, which of these following questions would be appropriate, or which of the following would be appropriate in a shopping center of this size? And this one might be a little difficult, and it shows you, I think, the type of broad knowledge you're going to need to have. So we know that there's a 50-50 split of square footage between convenience and shoppers' goods. Which of the following would be appropriate? A major grocery store and drugstore as prime tenants, either department or discount store as an anchor tenant, 3 department stores approximately the same size, D, a series of smaller stores with an anchor tenant. So a term I'm that familiar with, but I got to think they mean like retail goods versus 125,000 of convenience. So if you start eliminating your different options, a series of smaller stores rather than an anchor tenant, I don't think that would get at that 50-50 split. So I would remove D. If you take a look at number C, 3 department stores of approximately the same size. There's no such thing as a convenience department store, I don't think, anyway. So I would eliminate C. Plus, they're saying 3 department stores. And if you're looking at 50-50 split, it's probably not a good fit either. And I think you could quickly narrow it down to A and B. But when you look at the sheer volume of size, 125,000 square feet of leasable area has to be to convenience, and the same has to be to retail goods. A major grocery store and a drugstore as prime tenants. A big grocery store is 70,000 square feet. The average size of a grocery store in the United States is 50,000 square feet, and I think you can find that information. Just throw in Google average size of a grocery store, and a drugstore. A big drugstore is about 14,000 square feet, and so those aren't going to get you anywhere near that 125,000 square feet of leasable area. So this one you're going to come at, I think, through elimination and get to B. The next question, same scenario, but this is where some calculation comes in. If an average of 400 square feet is needed to accommodate each parking space and associated driveways, what would be the approximate acres of the blacktop of this site? So you're assuming in that 400 square feet, your 20 by 10 parking stall, and then another 200 square feet of circulation. So, which would include any type of roads, driveways. So to calculate it, what there's 450 square feet per parking space. There's 1,300 parking spaces, and commit this number if you don't know it. Commit it to memory probably for the rest of your career as a planner. 43,560 square feet in an acre. So you do the math, and you end up with 11.94 acres, which is B, between 10 and 15 acres. So with that, that concludes our webinar this morning, and want to wish you best of luck on the exam. We know it's challenging, frustrating, and rewarding all at the same time. So wish you the best of luck. And with that, Jamie, we will wrap it up and turn it over to Q&A.
Great, thanks. We can still see your screen. Do you want me to?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I wanted to make sure I had that chat window.
Great.
Up.
So the first question that was asked was related to planning prep. Do you want to tell people about planning prep real quick?
Sure. Well, planning prep is it's just an online study resource, and again, it shouldn't be the only thing that you use to help you prepare for the exam, but it's a free website that Trevor and I created, and it just provides practice questions and answers as well as explanations. It's to help you prepare for the exam. You can, I'll call it up here on, up on the screen. So there's a question of the week, and when you log in, you can see anywhere from, I think, 1,000 different questions, similar to what you might find on the exam.
Devin, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Sure.
When you, sorry, hang on 1 second. How do you log on for the first time? You said it's free. Do people just, is there a way to? Oh, right there.
Yeah.
It says not a
Yeah.
member yet, register now.
Right. And what will happen is they'll get an email that basically confirms that it's a valid email. They'll get a link emailed to them, and they click on it, and their account is active.
Okay. Go ahead. So somebody else was asking, are there still 12 practice exams available on Planning Prep?
Let's see. There are 12 practice exams. Yeah, I guess that said 7 in the presentation, but there are 12, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to say about Planning Prep?
Well, and just that, I mean, keep in mind that these aren't questions from the exam. You know, we haven't, they're questions that Trevor, John, and I have created over the last 10 years. And so they're questions, I think, similar to what you might find on the exam. So special districts can be described as which of the following. And it's a multiple choice based exam or website. And I will say I'm glad this one came up. There's a lot of these all of the aboves on here because we developed this website as a way for people to learn some of the concepts and refresh their knowledge. And so there's a lot of questions where you'll see all of the above. That's going to be the correct answer. In this case, it wasn't. So that's. But I think there's a disproportionate amount of all of the above, and it's because we're trying to help people learn the concepts. But you can see it tells me here wrong. The correct answer is C, and then it gives us some explanation of what a special district is. And then beneath there's some different links, and then members can come in here and add comments. If there's a dead link, they can give it like a thumbs down. It'll drop that comment down there if someone posts something that maybe you disagree with. But part of making it free is we added a whole interactive component to the website where people can sort of leave a note for someone else coming behind them to help everyone prepare for the exam.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier something about Facebook study groups, and I have to admit I wasn't paying close attention at that point. Were you suggesting people could use Facebook to form study groups?
Yeah, well, we created, if you go to facebook.com/planningprep, there's a Planning Prep Facebook page. And so if someone can do sort of chat, basically we're trying to provide a forum for people to have discussion about preparing for the exam. If a question that came out last 2 weeks ago was that I'm trying to form a study group with people who live in jumping on here, they can sort of post that and they can connect with other people in their area. Or even if it's just a web-based study group, but a way to, I think, talk to and chat with other people that are preparing for the exam.
Okay, great. There was a study guide.
Yeah, Chapter President's Council guide. And,
is that available online, or is that something people have to purchase?
Well, that's that CD-ROM, Jamie, that you
That's
used to sell. Yeah, and
so
I think it's available by purchase.
Yes, so that it is a CD, and for those of you on the attendee side, if you contact your professional development officer, they should have it, or you could contact your chapter president, since it's their council that puts it together.
Yeah, and what I was saying with that is there's like, say Chapter 13, it's the Basic Guide to Concepts on Quantitative Methods. It's written by Barbara Becker. Mm-hmm. I found the original one of this that I had in a photocopied binder from probably the late 90s. And so what I think when this CD-ROM was put together, they just scanned in all of those sheets and did like a character recognition, and I think it created a lot of typos that, for a topic area that you don't want a lot of typos, this one I noticed quite a bit, and there's a lot of referring to the table on page 197, and it's referencing parts of an old document, and so I think it could use a good proofread and cleanup.
Okay. Let's see. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between forecast and projection?
Well, I guess it's really sort of the same thing. It's population forecasting and projecting is just sort of identifying where you think your population is going to be in the next time period, whatever it is, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. But a population projection and forecast are the same thing.
Great. Trevor had said that there was an important person associated with budgets and that you should know their name, and there was a quote. Can he repeat that?
It's Aaron Waldowski, and the quote is, "A budget is a series of events tied with price tags attached." And
Please say it one more time just for good measure so everybody hears it.
Okay. His name is Aaron, Aaron Wildansky, Wildansky. A budget may be characterized as a series of goals with price tags attached. He adds, since funds are limited and have to be divided in one way or another, the budget becomes a mechanism for making choices among alternative expenditures. When choices are coordinated so as to achieve desired goals, a budget may be called a plan.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. Is it likely that the exam will include questions about the details of the types of bonds and funds that you were talking about?
No. I think you just need to know what they are. I don't think, there's so many things to test in terms of the general broad knowledge of planning. You're not going to need to know the nuts and bolts of all the different financing mechanisms.
Okay. I think we talked about this question the last time we did this session together 2 weeks ago, but is there a good planning reference for budget and finance? And I think I looked on the APA's website and couldn't find anything. Do you know of anything?
This Chapter President's Council guide, Chapter 17, is pretty good.
Okay.
It's basically 18 pages on budgeting. And the other book, it's the Wiley & Sons, APA's Urban Planning and Urban Design Standards.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some in there. And then I don't know if it's still a recommended reading, but it's the Green Bible, which is the practice of local government and planning. And I know a lot of this material, even within the Chapter President's guide, comes straight out of that Green Bible. They've reprinted it. It's a new book now, and I don't think it's as useful to the field of planning as the old one was. I think the new one is put out by the ICMA, County Mayors Association, or Cities and Mayors Association. And so it's provided general knowledge of planning to, I think, a group of people that may not be familiar with planning. The old one, when I say old, I'm trying to think of the published date on it. It's probably in the 70s. Mm-hmm. It was referred to when, back in, as the Green Bible.
Right.
And I know there's a lot in there on budgeting, and so if you can get a copy of that or get your hands on it, I know it's in every planning library. And
okay.
Every old planning department might have a copy sitting on a shelf somewhere. But I wouldn't recommend the new one for that as a study resource, but definitely the old one.
Great. If we can just take a couple more questions here. You had mentioned getting the average size of a grocery department, grocery or department store and using Google. Mm-hmm. Do you think people need to memorize those sort of things, or how would you know that for the exam?
Yeah, I don't know. That's just sort of one of these Jeopardy type questions that show up. You either know it or you don't. And I'll be honest, one of the things in preparing for this webinar, I took a look at the practice questions provided by the AICP or the APA, and I looked at that one, and I had to go ask Dan Gardner in our office. I said, hey, Dan, can you answer this question? And he looked at it, and right away he goes, oh, it's B. A grocery store is never that big. And then so that sent me to Google to find out, how big an average grocery. I knew a big Jewel was 70,000 square feet, but I had no idea how big the average grocery store was.
Right.
And so he said a super Target's typically about 125,000, or can get up about that big. So, but yeah, I don't know. And maybe and maybe that's sort of the broad test of planners. As planners work in the communities throughout the country, they see petitions from developers looking to build grocery stores and department stores, and come to know in general terms how big these boxes are.
Great.
And that I think we covered that in plan making, but there might be some math that.
Okay. Did you? Let's see. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. I think you covered. You covered shift share analysis.
Yeah.
Okay. So the person who is asking about shift share analysis can go back and listen to the recording. We won't go back through it again. Is regional tax-based sharing typically mandated by the state? Do you know the answer to that?
No.
No, it's not, or no, you don't know the answer?
No, it's not.
Okay. When
MPO or state in Wisconsin is done by the county.
Okay. Did you give an example of cost-benefit analysis?
We did not give an example of cost-benefit analysis. I mean, it's probably an example of a long, drawn-out calculation that you would never have to perform as part of the exam.
Okay.
So I think you just need to know the basic principles of it, and that if costs outweigh the benefits, you're not going to do it. If the benefits outweigh the costs, you are going to want to do it.
Okay.
But there are examples in the chapter president's guide, and you could probably find examples online.
Great. And I think, did you go over the 3 steps of budget making, a budget prep?
Trevor?
If you did, I don't want them to be repeated here. I just want to make sure that they were covered. While you're looking that up, I'll ask another question.
Yeah, Trevor did go over that, Jimmy.
Okay, so for the person who asked about that, you can go back and listen to the recording and hear that.
Right, it's basically...
Let's see. Someone was asking about the 2010 census, and since I know the answer to that question, I'll just go ahead and answer it. The 2010 census will not be covered on the exam. It's the 2000 census numbers that will be covered. Let's see. Also, just to answer everybody's question at once, this session will be available via recording on the Utah website. It will not be available as a PowerPoint or a PDF of the slides. Did you go over cost-effectiveness analysis, or is that different than cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, Trevor went over that as well.
Okay.
It was the last topic that Trevor.
Okay. Now, there was a question early on, Devin, and I think you presented. It was right around when when we were talking about standard deviation and means. You had a question about value greater than 0. Does that sound familiar to you? Someone's asking about that question.
Oh, yeah, that was just an example question. It was this one here. Which of these numbers is greater than 0? And it's sort of just a comical look at some of these answers might be on the exam. Because C and D are both correct. They're both greater than 0. But D is more correct because it's further away from 0.
Great.
So it's an example of how frustrating I think the exam can be, because there are often multiple correct answers. And it's going to be up to you to figure out which of these is most correct.
Okay. Do we have time for one more, or do you need to go?
No, sure, we can do one more.
Okay. There was a symptomatic sample question.
Mm-hmm.
You solve it?
Sure, right here. So we have 312 single-family permits.
Let's see that. All I see is webinar structure, that slide.
Oh, how's
There
that?
it is. It's up now. It's up now.
Okay. And this is where I was saying you get 99.8, but there's no such thing as 0.4 people if you get a question like this. So you're going to get 999 people out of the single family. We have 62 dwelling units and 40 dwelling units, so there's 102 multifamily dwelling units at 2.4, and so that's 245. So 245 is 44, and you add that to the 24,000 that the population was starting at since the So that would be how to solve that one.
Can you put up the slide about location quotient again? I think people just wanted to copy the formula down.
Sure.
And while you're doing that, if someone's asking if you could talk about the pitfalls of cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, I'll hand that off to John.
Let me know when you're on, John.
Yeah, again, in the pitfalls of cost-benefit analysis, and this is sort of stressed out in the Part 5, the Quantitative Methods publication. And they even stress in there, and this is why we can say very safely that there's not going to be a detailed mathematical equation or math that has to be conducted with regard to a cost-benefit analysis. They state even specifically in the study manual, its real benefit as a concept, as a way of approaching conceptually, even stress in there that it's often too complicated or unrealistic to use as an exact mathematical formula to figure out the benefit of a project. There's too many variables. Some of the pitfalls are that you often use current day cost or valuation as opposed to projected or future valuation and cost. Being made that are not based solely off the benefit as derived from a cost-benefit formula or analysis. The costs are fairly easy to enumerate. The benefits a bit more challenging to enumerate. But what isn't getting to take into place is, boy, this is something that is a priority for our community, so we have to do this. Or we ran into this problem 6 years ago. We're never going to let that happen again. So no matter what it costs, we're not going to let that happen. So emotion and politics and single issue drivers often make it impossible to effectively use cost-benefit analysis if you're looking at something that is statistically followed very closely as a mathematical analysis. So they say it's a good concept or an approach by which to evaluate or to examine a problem, and the real value is in that concept. The real value is not in the actual statistical analysis of the value of cost versus the value of benefit, because it's almost impossible in the public realm to get at that because too many other things sort of intervene.
Can you advance the slide one so people can see the greater than 1, less than 1 related to location quotient, please? Thanks. If there are no other questions popping up, so if people have questions, please send them. Otherwise, we'll leave this slide up for a minute here so people can take a look at it again and write it down. But this is your last chance to ask questions before we finish the session. And also, I received an email this morning from the people who coordinate this webinar series, and hopefully, it seems like you all got the email, but the session that was supposed to happen on the 30th will actually happen on the 29th because there was a scheduling conflict. You should all have received an email about that, but I just wanted to verbally remind you. Let's see. There was a question about scoring the exam. At the end of the exam, when you get your score, as I remember, you just get an overall score. You don't see like you did really well in this section and you need to work on this section. Is that your memory as well?
Yeah, you don't get a breakdown by section. You just get congratulations, you passed, or sorry, you didn't pass. You don't get, on the planning prep exams on the website that we've got, you can see how you've done by category. You can see how you've done by law, by theory, by plan making, by ethics. You can go back and query your questions to see how you've done in each specific category. In the actual exam, no, you will get a here's your score, you passed, here's your score, you didn't. You will not get a breakdown.
Okay, that's what I remembered.
Yeah.
A couple of people have asked, so I will just say it out loud again. The PowerPoint presentation will not be available after today's session. The recording will be available on the Utah chapter website. So it won't be on APA's website. If you try to look at APA's website, you won't find anything about this. All of the recordings are on the Utah website. Pennsylvania was putting some up, but I don't know if they've put all up. I do know that Utah is doing all of them. Let's see. Can you put up the slide? Oh, sorry, you just went off that page. But can you put up the slide about the standard deviation in the bell curve again? And for the person who's complaining that I suggest people go back to the recording to listen to topics that have already been covered, the reason I'm saying that is because our speakers only have a few more minutes. And if you have a question about what's been said, then you should go back and listen to the recording if it's already been covered. I don't think we need to waste everybody's time going back through a topic that's already been covered. And I'm sorry to disagree, but that's the way we're doing it.
You can download it and put it on your playlist and impress everybody in your office with how cool your playlist is. So you got some Green Day, some Coldplay, some AICP training webinar sessions. Pretty impressive
The last
stuff.
question here is about the Green Book. They just wanted to clarify that you said that you felt a new version was not preferable.
Yeah, the older one seems to be more widely distributed and available, and that one, we've had several people in our office who took the exam who used that and said it was maybe the most helpful thing when it came to the statistics component of the exam preparation. And the new Green Bible is actually yellow. The old book is actually green, and it's been referred to that for seems like decades. And then when they came out with a new version and republished it, they made it yellow. So a little faux pas on the cover design, but the green one is particularly effective for this topic area. Most people who use that often say it was the best source of information.
Great.
So it was the practice of local government planning.
Let's see. People are still asking about the PowerPoint. No.
Can you still see our screen?
Yes. Hold on. The PowerPoint will not be available. The recording will be available, and the recording will include both what you're seeing on your screen as well as the audio. And then someone just asked for the Z-score again.
Tab.
Oh, you're showing the location.
Yeah, sure. A Z-score is how many standard deviations you are away. So if you look at the image here, you can see the Z-scores along the bottom. So if your Z-score is 1.2, you're 1.2 standard deviations away from the mean. And so the higher the Z-score, the closer you, the further you are away from the mean or the average of the sample.
Okay. Okay, I think that's it. I know you guys really have to be out of here. As Devin and John are the owners of a private firm, they're on their way to an interview. So I think as fellow planners, we understand that time restriction, so we will let you go.
Great, thank you, Jen.
As I mentioned, and I'll say it one more time, the Utah website is the best one to go to find these sessions. All of the previous sessions have been recorded as well. A reminder that the March 30th session will actually be happening on March 29th. You should have received an email about it. I think that's all, and good luck to everybody taking the exam, and thanks to our presenters today.
Great, and thanks again, Jamie. Good luck, everyone.
Bye-bye.